There are some memes on the internet about loudness, favoring loudness over musicality. And I understand that to be outside of the less is more philosophy, do you think because the user now has all kinds of ways of listening to the music back, like from your iPhone or cell phone, you think there's going to be a point where the sonic quality doesn't really matter?
Here's what I'd like to say about that, and I know you've got some really interesting technological viewpoints on this, but let me just start the conversation by saying that a great song that sounds bad is way better to listen to than a bad song that is sonically fantastic. So you're always going to listen to a great song, and you're never going to listen to a bad song. So if you can have a great song sound good, you've got gold. And there's enough audio professionals in the world, and there's enough time spent on learning how to manipulate audio, decades and decades and decades of people that have really perfected the art. And, you know, when I started out with Doug Sachs in 1991, I got to know a lot of the greats. I mean, to mention one or two, Al Schmidt, George Massenburg, you know, people like this, Val Garay, you know, were out there, you know, making immaculate sounding albums in the 1970s with pure analog circuitry. You know, if you listen to Val Garay's James Taylor album, JT, it's this immaculate sounding album. There were so many of them that were done then, and I was lucky enough to be in on resurfacing them when Sony did a push to redo all those albums to promote their SBM technology. But that's for another topic. So I think we're at a point now where the manufacturers have put tools into the hands of anybody who wants them. The tools are so inexpensive now and so accessible, and the mentor-protege relationships have been altered to some degree, but you can still get good mentoring through videos like this video, like this interview, like you can still get good mentoring through relationships, through video tutorials, through various means now, unlike before where you really had to be a protege and an apprentice and work your way up. And you know, I think there's no excuse to sound bad anymore. There's so much information out there, and there's so many great tools out there, that the basic lows, mids, and highs are fully achievable and attainable. Even if you don't have a full handle on the processing technology, you can still put together a picture where your ear zones in on a melodic structure, and there's bass and drums and all the slow stuff to support that. So the sonic integrity will always matter. And I think if something sounds too thin and edgy, it'll be a little bit piercing. If it sounds too muffled, everybody will get irritated with that. So even with rudimentary skills, you can really put together a decent picture. And anything that relates to resolution and more technological information like that, there's enough information out there that we can go for it. But I think we can get even deeper in the technological discussion from another standpoint that I know you've got thoughts on. So why don't you pick it up from
well, the thing is that it's funny because when I first started, and I went to audio engineering school, and we were talking about loudness, I thought, well, I'm going to be one of these people that really likes loudness, because why not, you know? And I think that's a common thing with younger engineers. Before they really understand what the downfall of pushing something beyond where it wants to be pushed, all the negative things that come along with that. And you know, a great analogy is putting too much salt and pepper on a steak. You know, you lose the flavor of the steak. You know, putting just the right amount of seasoning on something really brings something to life. That's what compression really kind of is. You know, it's for control and bringing and extracting. It's for tightening and putting focus, but also extracting the goodness out of whatever it is, be it on a single track or a global mix. So the thing about loudness is why does somebody want it loud? Well, it's really two things. It's to reach the listener, and sometimes they feel like they have to force something to really feel like the music is reaching them and therefore the audience. And then it's also to compete, right? So your music is as loud as something else out there, or maybe everything else out there, or maybe you want to be the loudest thing in the world, right, to stand out, which is somewhat coming from a place of insecurity. it's fine to do because loudness is actually really great. You know, if you can achieve some level for the right reasons, why not? It does reach you. But there's a point of diminishing returns, and that's a very subtle thing. Just going a little too far ends up blurring into the place of where you end up feeling a little bit like you're not quite connected to the music as much. There starts to be a little bit of a disconnect that occurs, and then if you go a little further than that, you might end up in a scenario where somebody ends up wanting to turn something down, you know, where they might turn it on for the first 20 seconds, and then they're reaching for the volume knob trying to find it, and then they go one click down, and then it's not reaching them at all anymore, and they go back up to where they were, and then they're in between those two places, and that's one of the biggest downfalls of what ends up happening if you print something too loud for that mix, which is very important to understand, is that it's not too loud for music, maybe, because there's a whole spectrum of where you can end up in terms of how loud you should push something for each individual mix or each individual batch of mixes that you're working on, which is also an important thing to consider. So let's just talk about singles for a second. Where should I put this thing that I'm working on in terms of level? And it has everything to do with how that mix is mixed and in the dynamic content of that mix. So hypothetically, let's say I'm presented as a mastering engineer with a hip hop track, right? And it's actually pretty hyped already in the mix because the mixing engineer maybe put something on the bus, or maybe they mixed in a compression on the individual elements in addition to putting something on the bus, and they've ended up in this place where it's already pretty hot, right? So I have to figure out, okay, what is creating this to sound hot? Maybe you might be presented with a situation where it's really not that hot, but it's just a very open mix, meaning that the 808, the kick, and the snare, or the clap, are very forward, but the actual guts of the mix, the body, the vocal, maybe the pads, the synths, all the other melodic instruments in the arrangement are actually kind of far behind those hard-hitting transients of the 808 kick and clap. So, do you make it louder? What do you do? Well, how does it reach, forget all of that. How is it reaching you? Does it speak to you? Maybe you actually want to compress it. Compress those claps in a little bit, compress that 808 and kick in. Not so you're conscious of that compression. You have to do it in a way that feels natural, but just hug those in a little bit. And now you have room to bring it up. So you might end up in a place where you're actually, the claps and the 808s and the kicks are a little bit more hugged in, and those are actually relatively not as forward. But the overall mix feels bigger, and it's blooming more because the body of the mix, all the other elements are actually pushed up a little forward. So you have something that's relatively a little more dense, and then you have some room to push it up even further, and you might get some more size. Not necessarily level, because level is relative to wherever you started. But you might end up in a place that actually feels bigger. But what is the end goal? Do you feel connected to this thing? Is it reaching you? Are you grooving with it? Do you want to keep it? Do you want to play it again? Those are the things that you want to key in on. But here's the other thing that's really important, that this has only happened since these streaming platforms have become the main place where everybody listens and enjoys music, is the streaming platforms. The streaming platforms themselves are leveling everything down for the most part to a lower common denominator, and the reason being is the user experience, right? So if you push something louder and louder and louder, you're going to end up in a place of where it's just the streaming platforms are going to push back against that initiative, and you're going to end up with something that feels loud and turned down, which ultimately sounds loud and small. So you want to go off maximum impact, maximum size, maximum connection. And you can really get into a point of where you fine-tune. You can push it a little tenth further, and you can feel like, it's feeling actually kind of smaller. That's something that's kind of surprising, is actually when you back it off, it actually can sound louder sometimes, because your perceived level is actually expanding further, and you're not folding this thing down by hitting the ceiling, and it starts collapsing in on itself. So these are the things to key in on in the mastering process in terms of how to reach that maximum size potential if that's what you're going for. And I'll just end it with this. Sometimes that's not what you're going for. It's not that we're trying to always make the thing sound as big and as bloomed as possible, because that has a certain texture and feel and sound element to it. Some of my favorite recordings that we've worked on are actually certainly not the loudest thing in the world. Backing it off and letting it breathe and letting it have a certain delicate nature is as much as part of the musical process as anything else. There's great records that are a little bit more gentle and delicate, and that is the texture and vibe of the album. That is the message. That is what you're supposed to take in as a listener is the gentle aspect. And that could so easily be lost if you try to push it up just for the sake of maybe getting another half dB of level, what have you. It could sound great that way too, but there's a certain element in texture that could be very easily missed if that's all you're focused in on. So all these things are very important in terms of where you want to end up.
You know, listening to you brings me back to when I worked on the soundtrack for Oh Brother, Where Art Thou. That did very well. It was very well received. That album spanned 80 years of music. Many people know that album. Even people of the new generation are familiar with that album. You know, a lot of decades of music were spanned across on that production, and T-Bone Burnett put that album together, soundtrack for that movie. And one of the things we paid attention to was actually going as low as we could. And the reason is this. I'd like to expand on it a little. When you're doing what we do on the console, the job really isn't to squash the dynamics down so that we can raise the average level. Because the moment we do that is the moment that we are actually altering the intent of the mixer. The mixer sets the dynamic range, the peak to average ratio, the amount measured in decibels that you can measure between the average level and the highest peak. That intent is set in the mix, and a lot of times what'll happen is when that mixer gives that track to an artist for approval, they'll either put a compressor on that to kind of squash that down a little bit and mimic what's going to happen out in the world, or they'll mix through it to begin with. But when you deal with a project like, say, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, where the dynamic range is really something to contend with, it's a much a part of the picture as anything else. You have to pay attention to that once we get our hands on it. So we got to be very careful not to alter that dynamic range and make that music sound smaller. So when this music goes out to the streaming platforms that are now altering it, what's going to happen if you compress a mix down and you push the dynamics closer to the average level, allowing you to raise your average level without reaching a level of distortion in your digital deliverables. What's going to happen is that when that music gets lowered, it's going to sound smaller next to something that has the same average level but higher peaks. That's going to sound bigger, more lush. So by default, what started out when CD players went into the car is now being reversed. And what I mean by that is that when CDs were in the car, you had much more ambient noise to compete with. So in order to raise that level and compress those peaks down, you would use a compressor to create this kind of compression and allow the listener to really feel all of the music and not miss the low parts. And what that went into is the multiple disc CD changer and playlists and all kinds of stuff, where everybody kind of got the idea that the music should then be louder and louder and louder and louder, and they want their song louder than the other person, and the listener never really wanted that. They just want something even so they don't have to make their adjustments throughout. So that's really our purpose in the first place, is to kind of create that overall balance so you don't have to adjust anything. Just put it on, listen to it, take the music in, and the more dynamic range there is, generally the more enjoyable of an experience listening is. So now that we're in a place where the streaming platforms are actually setting their own LUFS levels and updating them, it's not a hardcore situation where they stick to it. They're working with technology, working with the trends of humanity to alter them, and they keep in touch with us audio professionals, and they have a good presence in the pro audio community, and we work together in determining what these levels should be, constantly consulting with each other, and coming up with something that's really a little more palatable than it used to be in terms of how much compression is used to close that gap between the highest peak and the average level. So it really is one of the enjoyable things about the world we live in with streaming technology is the increased dynamic range in music. It's come back around.
And it means that we can just make the finished result. We're going for greatness. That's all we're going for. We're going for connectivity, in terms of how that music reaches you, but we're going for the best place for this record to live, right? And that's a subjective thing. It's not just us, making that call. It's us presenting that to the artist, the producer, the mixing engineer, the label, all the powers that be. Maybe we're doing a reissue project, and it's the artist's estate if they're no longer with us, right? So it's a collaborative process also. But what we can all go for now more than ever is only for greatness, and that's actually something that we've always done. We've always pushed for that as mastering engineers. We've never just tried to jam something because we feel like we might make somebody happy on the first day of they listen. Because we want to have their back. We want to make sure that they don't regret those decisions. And not all artists, certainly not just, artists are conscious of what can happen if you push something louder than where it wants to be, where it's what it's mixed for, So they trust us, and that trust needs to be developed and maintained. So we have their back, so they don't regret their decisions months down the line once they've heard it more than once,
Yeah, what's curious about that, when I'm thinking back on the work we did on John Lennon's Imagine album.
Yeah.
You have to present it once you're done with your work in a way that is nostalgically familiar, but at the same time survives in today's world. So we are further along than if we were to cut this to vinyl in the 1970s when the record was made. Because we live in a world with more ambient noise around us, and we live in a mobile world, so there is compression. There is a use for that, and what we have to go for when working on catalog music, as that's referred to, is getting that nostalgic size, depth of field, dynamic range, and at the same time making it fit into a world of today. So it's a very careful balance of all of these technologies, and a very astute consciousness and a conscious approach to how to use all that and combine all that to create a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. I always say that because that's ultimately what we're going for. And when he says we shoot for greatness, we're shooting for something that sounds like we were never there. And if we can achieve that, then we've achieved that greatness. We've achieved a service to the music that is something that the fan will connect to and listen to. So there's so many angles to look at this topic from, and that's just a couple of them. And when we work on new music, it's that same thing where we have to get something that fits into today's world, but let it breathe, let it be sizable. And one of the other ways to look at this is if somebody's doing a mix and it ends up being a little over compressed and there's no time to fix it, there's no budget to fix it, we can sit and ride the verse and ride the chorus and bloom out a chorus and then bring it back down with EQ and create a sense of dynamic range that might not be there and help it fit into today's world. So this happens all the time too. There was a period in time where mixes were heavily compressed, and when those mixes come out and get resurfaced, as music does every couple of decades, we can help add the dynamic range to fit into today's world, because it's a different kind of dynamic range from the 1970s. Back then you'd put on a record, pour yourself something to drink, sit on your couch, put the stylus on the record, and take a listen without much without much ambient noise. In today's world, now that we're getting more dynamic range by default, we're still living in a mobile world. There's still ambient noise to compete with. So it's a different type of dynamic range, if that makes any sense. It's a swell and a feel and a depth and a size and a bloom. It's the same concept, it's the same thing, but you're still competing with ambient noise, and that's something to consider as we process this music. So we can get in there and we can use our tools to try to make the music move more than it was, But ultimately speaking, the mixer is the one who sets the dynamic range, and if we alter it, it's a choice and a conscious approach to the music. So that's something to consider when you consider our process in the chain of events.